She thought it was just an old silo, rusted, forgotten, sealed shut by time. But when her injured dog limped toward it with a strange urgency, she followed. And everything she knew about her family's land began to unravel. Inside those corroded walls were secrets buried deeper than the foundation secrets meant to stay hidden. And the closer she got to the truth, the more she realized someone else was watching and waiting. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's episode is even more unbelievable than this one. The sun was barely up when Callie noticed her dog wasn't at the porch like usual. Duke never missed morning rounds, not since she rescued him half-starved in a ditch 2 winters ago. But today, the water bowl sat untouched, the gate still latched, and the silence stretching across the yard felt thick in her chest. She called out once, twice, voice clipped from sleep, then grabbed her hat and boots. A bad feeling had settled behind her ribs, the kind you can't explain, only follow. She found his trail by instinct more than sight, paw prints pressed deep into the soft morning mud, spaced unevenly like he was dragging one leg. The prints led past the barn, past the windmill that hadn't turned in a decade, and out toward the north ridge, toward the silo. Callie slowed. That silo had been here longer than she had. Nobody used it anymore. The roof was caved in on the far side, and a thick patch of sagebrush had grown around its base like nature was trying to bury it. Her father used to say the silo was cursed, half joking but never twice in the same tone. She remembered the way he avoided looking at it when they'd ride past, always pulling the horses into a faster trot. As a kid, she used to make up ghost stories about it just to scare herself, but that was years ago. Since then, it had just been a landmark, a shadow. She rounded the last clump of scrub and spotted Duke sitting still in front of the silo like a statue carved from muscle and dust. His injured leg was bandaged from an old injury, but he didn't seem to notice the pain. His ears were perked, his body tense, gaze fixed not at her but at the base of the silo. He didn't move when she called his name, didn't even blink. "Duke," she said again, softer now, but her voice got swallowed in the quiet. Then she saw it just below where the rusted ladder met the dirt, a faint scrape of metal in the dirt, something circular, buried just enough to hide under normal light. But Duke's paw had pushed the dirt away. Callie crouched, brushing the rest aside with her fingers. The metal hatch was old, streaked with oxidized green and welded shut at the edges. There was no handle, just a set of numbers carved into the rim. She pressed her hand to the surface, half expecting it to be cold. But it was warm, faintly, impossibly warm. A shiver passed through her. She stood slowly, eyes rising to the silo's tower above her. The ladder leaned precariously, half the rungs bent or broken, as if someone had tried to climb it years ago and failed. Duke let out a low whine behind her, and something in that sound, some mix of warning and memory, made her chest tighten. Callie looked up at the silo again, and for the first time in her life, it looked like it was watching her back. Callie didn't scare easy. She'd faced rattlers in the feed shed, dragged calves out of icy creeks with her bare hands, and once stitched her own leg after catching barbed wire on a midnight ride. But the way Duke was watching that hatch made her mouth go dry. He wasn't curious, he was waiting, like he'd seen this before, like he remembered something she didn't. The bandage on his leg was stained again, and she made a mental note to redress it, but he didn't so much as limp as he circled the silo, nose low, tail rigid. She followed. The dirt around the silo was uneven, brittle in some spots, damp in others. Her boots sank deeper than she expected near the rear wall, where the sun hadn't hit yet. There, the scent changed. Not rot, not oil, but something sharp and chemical. Duke whined again and pawed at the edge of a warped concrete slab that jutted from the foundation like it didn't belong. When she knelt beside him, brushing more dirt aside, her fingers caught the edge of a panel. Square, bolted, hidden in plain sight. She stood quickly and scanned the horizon. Nobody. Just dry brush, rocky ledges, and the distant hum of cicadas starting their day. Her heart thumped hard in her chest. She knew this land had ridden every fence line and patched every cracked pipe. But this wasn't part of any map. And if it wasn't mapped, it was meant to be forgotten. She went back to the front hatch and gave it a push, more out of frustration than hope. Nothing. Rust held it fast like a lock welded by time. But then she remembered something, her grandfather's old crowbar. She hadn't touched it in years. It was still hanging in the back of the machine shed. She was almost certain. She hesitated, eyes flicking back to the hatch, then to Duke, then back again. "Stay," she said, and Duke didn't move. The run back to the shed felt longer than it should have, her legs heavy with adrenaline. The crowbar was right where she remembered, dusty, but strong. The grip still had the blue tape he'd wrapped around it the summer she turned 13. She ran back without stopping. With the bar wedged under the hatch's lip, she put her full weight into the first pull. The metal groaned, resisting. On the second pull, it shrieked. On the third, it popped. A puff of stale, metallic air hissed out, the scent older than memory. Callie coughed, waving the dust aside. The opening was narrow but deep, framed by rusted steel and an old ladder that disappeared into the dark below. She wasn't expecting to see light down there, but there it was, a faint green glow, pulsing like a heartbeat, coming from somewhere deep inside the earth. She looked down at Duke. He was already standing at the edge, tail stiff, ears alert, waiting for her to go first. Callie gripped the top rung and tested her weight. The metal groaned beneath her boots, but it held. She kept one hand on the crowbar just in case, heart hammering in her chest as she descended into the shaft. The green glow pulsed steadily from below, soft, rhythmic, almost alive. Every step down was a step away from the ranch, from what was familiar, and towards something she couldn't name. She couldn't hear Duke anymore, but she knew he was still above, watching, guarding. He always did. The ladder led about 20 feet down into a small chamber carved straight into the earth. The walls were reinforced with aging steel and warped beams, like it had been built in a hurry, by someone with more resources than patience. The air was cool, damp, and laced with that same chemical tang she'd smelled above. But there was something else down here too, something older. Dust and mildew, sure. But beneath that, paper, ink, decay. The green light was coming from a panel embedded in the far wall, glass cracked, wires exposed, and yet somehow still functional. Below it, a stack of crates sat untouched, covered by what remained of a weathered tarp. Her fingers trembled as she pulled it back, revealing a locked metal chest. She didn't have a key, but the latch was old. One sharp hit from the crowbar cracked it open with a snap that echoed down the tunnel like a gunshot. Inside were papers, dozens of them, some yellowed and curling, others preserved in plastic sleeves. There were photographs, schematics, and something that made her blood run cold, a worn envelope with her family's brand stamped on the seal. Her fingers hovered above it like it might burn her. She picked it up, broke the seal, and unfolded the pages inside. The handwriting was unmistakable, her grandfather's. Callie scanned the letter, eyes darting across lines filled with jargon and phrases she couldn't place. Field test abort, biothermal interface unstable, containment breach unlikely but critical to monitor soil composition. Then came the line that made her breath catch. "If anyone finds this, I'm sorry. I tried to warn them." Her vision blurred. Her grandfather had died when she was 7, a quiet man with rough hands and eyes that never quite looked you in the face. He wasn't the letter-writing type, and he never once mentioned anything about this. She shuffled the rest of the papers, recognizing blueprint sketches of the silo from above except in these drawings. It wasn't a silo. It was marked as a containment terminal. Whatever had been buried here, it wasn't grain. She pulled out a photo that had slipped between the pages, a black and white snapshot of 3 men in front of the silo. One of them was definitely her grandfather. The other 2 wore military uniforms. She flipped it over. The date read July 1953, long before the ranch had ever legally belonged to her family, and long before she was supposed to know any of this. Callie didn't sleep that night. The photo sat on the kitchen table, catching moonlight through the window. She kept reading the letter over and over, as if the words might change the 5th time through. But they didn't. I tried to warn them. Warn them about what? And why had no one ever spoken about this? Her father used to call the silo cursed, but now she wondered if that had been code for something else, for something true. By sunrise, she'd already saddled the truck. Duke jumped into the passenger seat like he'd been waiting all night, too. There was only one person left in the county old enough to remember the 1,950 seconds and still coherent enough to talk about it. Mr. Levi lived alone past the southern ridge in a house that leaned into the earth like it wanted to fall asleep. Her dad used to buy horses from him. The old man hadn't been seen much since the last county fair, but he'd served in Korea, and he'd known her grandfather. The drive took an hour. half of it spent dodging ruts that had been left to deepen for years. When she pulled up to the leaning house, the door was already open. Mr. Levi sat on the porch, a rusted shotgun across his lap and 2 dogs curled at his feet. "I was wondering when one of you'd come askin'," he said before she could speak. His voice was brittle but sharp, like fence wire ready to snap. Callie held up the photo. "This was taken in 1953. That's my grandfather." Levi didn't move. "That's Walter, all right. And that silo behind him ain't a silo." "What is it?" He laughed, short and dry. "It's a promise someone else broke, and a debt your family's been paying ever since." Callie took a slow breath. "He built something under that structure. Wrote letters about containment, about warnings." Levi finally met her eyes. "Did he mention the fire?" She shook her head. "What fire?" "The one that didn't show up in the papers. That thing under your land. It didn't come from here. It was brought in. Walter thought he could control it. So did the suits. They had a name for it. Called it the core sample. But it wasn't a rock. It pulsed, glowed, talked to the land." Her stomach turned. "What happened to it?" Levi looked toward the horizon, like he could still see it glowing through the earth. "They buried it, deep. Said it was sealed. Said it couldn't move. But sometimes when the ground got warm in winter, cattle would disappear. Fence posts would rot overnight. Your granddad stopped smiling after that." Callie gripped the photo tighter. "Why didn't anyone tell us?" "Because he made a deal. Sold the silence. Gave up everything so it'd stay quiet and stay down." Callie swallowed hard. "And if it wakes up?" Levi's eyes turned to hers again, clear, solemn, and certain. "Then you're gonna wish it stayed asleep." That night, Callie locked every door in the house. She'd never done that before. Out here, people didn't lock doors. There was no one to be afraid of. But Levi's voice kept echoing in her ears, "You're gonna wish it stayed asleep." Duke lay curled at the foot of the bed, his breathing steady but shallow. He was older now, slower than the pup she'd rescued, but there was something sharp in his eyes tonight. Like he knew more than he should. Like he remembered something she didn't. She drifted off near dawn, too exhausted to stay upright, but her sleep was thin and uneasy. She dreamed of green light pulsing beneath the floorboards, of her grandfather's voice whispering through the walls, and of the silo cracking open like an egg. She woke with a start to the sound of the screen door creaking. She rushed outside. Duke was gone. Panic hit her so fast it stole her breath. She called his name once, twice, louder, and when he didn't come, she grabbed her boots, threw on a coat, and sprinted toward the north field. The grass was damp from dew, the sky barely starting to shift from black to blue. She followed instinct first, then prints in the dirt. Same limp, same path, same impossible urgency. He was at the silo, sitting, staring, just like before, but this time, his eyes were fixed higher on a pipe that jutted out from the upper ring of the structure, something she hadn't noticed before. It was leaking a faint mist, barely visible, but sharp-smelling, like scorched earth and ozone. She shielded her nose with her arm as she stepped closer. The pipe had been welded shut at some point, then cut open crudely recently. There were jagged marks around the rim, and the dirt below it was dark, damp, and sunken like something had spilled. "Duke," she said softly. He didn't move. She looked down and saw what he had found. A fragment flat, metallic, no bigger than her palm. Burnt around the edges and etched with characters she didn't recognize. It had been half buried in the soil near the pipe, but Duke had dug it out, and now it lay at her feet like an offering. She picked it up. It was warm, faintly buzzing in her hand, like it held a current. There were more fragments scattered nearby, some half melted into the dirt. She turned to look at the hatch she'd opened days before. The ladder still led down into darkness, but the green glow was brighter now, stronger. Something was changing. She knelt next to Duke, running a hand along his back. His fur bristled. "You remember this place, don't you?" He didn't bark, didn't whine, just pressed his weight gently into her side, like he was anchoring her, like he was afraid she'd go down there again. But Callie knew now that she had to. Whatever her grandfather had buried, whatever he had sworn to keep secret, it wasn't done sleeping, and it had started to stir. She didn't tell anyone she was going back down. There wasn't anyone to tell, really. Most of the nearby ranchers had moved closer to town after the drought, and the few who stayed didn't come knocking unless a fence line was down or a calf got loose. Callie loaded her satchel with a flashlight, gloves, and the old revolver that still sat unloaded in her father's dresser drawer. She didn't know what good it would do, but holding it made her hands stop shaking. Duke stayed behind this time. She tied him up, gently, beside the porch with enough slack to move but not follow. He didn't fight her, just sat and watched with eyes that made her feel like she was walking away from something holy. The silo hatch opened easier now. The rust had loosened, or maybe the heat rising from below had softened the metal. Callie climbed down quickly, the air thicker than before, charged like the moments before a summer storm. The green glow had spread across the walls, leaking from hairline cracks in the steel. Whatever was below wasn't content to stay buried. She followed the same corridor as before but turned left this time, past the crates and files, deeper into a section she hadn't noticed on her first descent. There, half concealed behind rusted shelving, was a second hatch, smaller, set into the floor. This one was welded too, but the seal was broken. Not by time, by tools. Someone had already been here. Her stomach turned cold. Callie knelt beside the hatch and eased it open. A narrow shaft led downward, steep enough that the ladder had been replaced with steel rungs embedded into the concrete wall. She tested one solid. The flashlight beam disappeared quickly, swallowed by a darkness that felt almost alive. She started down. The air changed halfway cooler, but thicker. Not like soil, like breath. At the bottom, the space opened into what looked like a vault. Walls of corrugated steel lined with gauges, old control panels, and wires that had long since stopped obeying their original purpose. But something still powered the core of the room. In the center stood a structure cylindrical, 12 feet high, 6 across like a coffin standing on end. Its surface shimmered faintly, and at its base were more symbols like the ones on the metal fragment Duke had uncovered. She approached carefully, drawn by something she couldn't name. Curiosity, sure, but something else too: familiarity. As if her blood recognized what her mind could not. She placed a hand on the surface. It wasn't metal. It wasn't glass. It was something in between. And it was pulsing. Then the pulse stopped. The silence that followed was so complete it made her ears ring. And in that breathless stillness, a voice echoed not through the air, but from somewhere inside her head. "You are not the first." She stumbled back. The structure remained still, but now it knew she was here. She climbed out of the vault with her hands shaking and her jaw clenched tight. The voice hadn't spoken again, but its weight still echoed in her bones. "You are not the first." It hadn't sounded threatening. It hadn't even sounded human, but it had known her, or something in her, as if the thing sealed inside that structure could reach through time and memory, as if it had been waiting. Back above ground, the sun burned high but the wind felt cold. Duke barked once when she appeared, then whined low, pressing his body against her leg like he needed to feel her pulse. She knelt beside him, pressing her forehead to his. "I'm okay," she whispered, though the words tasted like lies. She spent the afternoon combing through the crates again. The files were organized, but in a way that didn't make sense, like someone had taken the time to hide certain patterns. Pages were missing. Sections redacted with thick, tar-like ink. Still, pieces emerged. Names she recognized from Levi's stories. Project Foundation. Biothermal artifact. A handwritten note tucked between two typed memos read, "Command insists it's not alive. It responds to proximity." That's not the same thing. Then, deeper in the last crate, buried beneath stacks of topographical maps, she found the folder that hadn't burned completely. The edges were blackened, the paper inside warped and fragile, but still legible. And what it revealed made her knees go weak. It wasn't just her grandfather. There were others. Farmers, scientists, soldiers. At least 24 names, all listed under exposure incidents. Every one of them marked with a code, some followed by no change, others followed by deterioration, and a few with a final, chilling word, ascent. She didn't know what it meant. Not yet, but the dates didn't lie. The incidents stretched back to the early 52nds, some as recent as 1979. Her grandfather's name appeared 5 times. The final entry read simply, "Removed from rotation, sealed site. Asset dormant." She looked up from the paper. Dormant, not dead, not destroyed, just waiting. The green light flickered beneath her feet again, and for a moment she felt it like static electricity across her skin. Something watching, something aware. She closed the folder carefully, as if noise might wake it. Whatever had been buried under the silo hadn't been forgotten. just hidden. And someone had tried very hard to make sure it stayed that way. Back on the surface, the air had shifted. The sun hung lower. The silence around the property had changed its tone. Less like solitude, more like surveillance. She didn't know what the artifact was, or what it wanted. But she was certain of one thing now. Her grandfather hadn't just failed to stop it, he'd lied to protect it, and it was waking up. Callie thought she'd seen every photo in the archive. Most were black and white, standard government issue faces caught mid-blink, names typed clean beneath grainy images. But tucked between two folded maps in a plain manila envelope was something different. It wasn't labeled, it wasn't official, and it wasn't old. She froze when she pulled it free. It was a color photograph, clearer than the rest, and already curling at the edges from heat or age. A woman stood in front of the silo, not unlike how Callie had just stood days ago. Same angle, same backdrop. But it wasn't that made her blood run cold. It was the woman's face. She looked exactly like Callie. Not vaguely similar, not like a cousin or great aunt. Exactly, right down to the slope of the jaw, the mole under the left eye, the streak of copper that ran through her dark hair. Her boots were scuffed in the same spot. The cut of her jacket, the same one hanging in Callie's closet, matched perfectly. The resemblance was so precise it defied logic. She flipped the photo over with trembling fingers. Field Agent 014, Post-Interaction Containment, May 1952. It didn't make sense. Callie wasn't born until 1989. Her mother had died before telling her much about the family line, and her father had only ever said the past was a tangle not worth pulling. But this woman, whoever she was, could have walked into Callie's kitchen and passed for her reflection. Duke whined beside her, as if he sensed something was wrong. She stared at the photograph for a long time, then held it next to her face in the cracked mirror by the cellar door. Same eyes, same jaw. No denying it. It wasn't just the silo that was connected to her family. It was her. She paced the kitchen, mind racing. She didn't believe in reincarnation, and she hadn't heard of any family twins or doppelgangers, but something deeper twisted in her gut. What if this wasn't coincidence? What if exposure to the artifact, whatever it was, left traces behind? Levi had said it talked to the land. Maybe it talked to people too, and maybe it didn't forget. She looked back down at the envelope the photo had come from and noticed a second slip of paper still inside. She pulled it out. It was a signed clearance form, authorization for genetic trace protocols, issued by a now-defunct agency name she didn't recognize. Subject: 014. Status: presumed dormant. Lineage viability. Confirmed monitor female descendant. Activation probable upon breach. Oh, activation. She couldn't breathe. She wasn't just related to the woman in the photo. She was designed to come back here. Whatever they had buried, whatever her grandfather helped hide it, had marked her long before she was born. And now, she had awakened it. The knock came just after sundown. 3 sharp raps. Not hurried, not tentative. The kind of knock that assumed you were home, awake, and expecting them. Callie froze mid-step. Duke growled low from under the table. He'd never growled at a knock before. She moved toward the door slowly, eyes scanning the dusk-washed yard through the dusty side window. A white pickup sat at the edge of the driveway, too clean, too new. And standing on the porch were 2 men in pressed flannel shirts, clipboard in hand, smiles like warning signs. She opened the door a crack. "Can I help you?" The taller man nodded politely. "Evening, ma'am. Sorry to drop in unannounced. We're with the Department of Agricultural Survey, just doing a routine inspection of legacy structures in the area." Legacy structures. Her blood went cold. "I didn't request any inspection," she said flatly. "No, ma'am," the second one said, voice smoother than the first. "But the data shows your property houses an unused grain silo registered prior to 1955. Under new zoning protocols, we're required to assess its structural integrity. Safety reasons." Callie didn't move. "I don't remember the department wearing boots like that," she said, nodding to the military-grade soles caked in red clay. "And I sure as hell don't remember it sending people after dark." For a moment, the man's smile faltered. Just for a flicker. Then it returned, wider this time. "May we come in, Miss Whitmore?" She slammed the door, bolted it. They didn't knock again. Not right away. But a folded envelope slid under the frame 10 seconds later. Callie stared at it, heart in her throat, then picked it up with shaking fingers. Inside was a note typed, unsigned, no header. You've uncovered sensitive materials. We understand your confusion. Let us help. Compensation is available in exchange for silence and immediate site closure. Consider your future carefully. Below the words was a number, a very large number, enough to pay off the land, enough to leave the ranch, enough to start over anywhere else in the country. She stared at the zeros, then she turned and looked toward the silo. Out the back window, she could still see the edge of the ridge glowing faintly, a green pulse rising like the steady breath of something buried but awake. The artifact, whatever it was, hadn't spoken again, but she felt it now. Not in her ears, but in her bones. It wasn't angry, it wasn't hostile, it was aware, and it was waiting. She could take the money, walk away, seal the hatch and never speak of it again. Or she could see this through. She opened the drawer and took out the photograph of the woman who looked like her, the one they thought had been forgotten. She folded the offer note, slid it into her pocket, and whispered to herself, "You made me for this, didn't you?" And the light in the distance pulsed once, brighter than before. As if in answer, the first explosion came just after midnight. A low boom that rolled through the valley like thunder dragged across gravel. Callie jolted awake to the glow orange, violent, and rising fast from the north ridge. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. The silo, it was burning. She was out the door before she registered her own footsteps, Duke at her heels, barking wildly. The sky above the silo pulsed with a sickly mix of firelight and green, the kind of glow that didn't come from gasoline or wood. Something inside that vault was fighting back. By the time she reached the ridge, the structure was half consumed. Flames poured from the top like a signal flare to something far beyond the hills. She felt heat on her face from yards away. And then she saw them, three dark figures at the base, dressed in the same flannel and boots as the men who had come knocking. Only now, they weren't pretending to be surveyors. One held a torch, another carried a case. The third was speaking into a radio. She dropped to her stomach behind a rise in the dirt, heart hammering, brain trying to process what she was seeing. They weren't trying to contain it, they were trying to destroy it. Duke growled softly beside her, hackles raised, eyes fixed. The fire was growing faster now, and the air buzzed with a strange electricity like the moment before a lightning strike. One of the men turned toward the hatch and tossed something into the shaft. A high-pitched hum followed, then a scream, not human, not animal, just sound, raw, vibrating, alive. The green light flared, blasting upward like a geyser, and the men ran. Callie didn't think, she sprinted. By the time she reached the base of the silo, two of them were already gone. The third, older, slower, stumbled behind, clutching his radio like it could save him. She shouted without meaning to. He turned. Their eyes met for a single heartbeat. Then he dropped the device and vanished into the dark. Callie stood alone before the hatch, flames licking the sky behind her, heat pressing against her skin. The artifact's glow pulsed in the smoke like a heartbeat, steady, patient, aware. She looked down into the dark shaft where the green light rose, felt its presence like a whisper in her blood. She pulled the folded photo from her jacket, the woman who looked like her, who might have been her, who might still be her, in some impossible way. "You didn't want to be forgotten," she whispered. The light pulsed once more. She dropped the photo into the hatch. The fire hissed as it swallowed the edges of the silo, collapsing beams and creaking steel groaning under the strain of decades of buried lies. But the green glow did not flicker. Not once. Callie stepped back from the flames. Whatever they'd buried beneath this ranch wasn't gone. It had survived fire. It had survived silence. And now, it had her name.